Hashem, lifnei Hashem kiva, lifnei Hashem kiva lishpoi, kiva lishpoi desadet, lifnei Hashem kiva lishpoi, kiva lishpoi desadet, lifnei Hashem kiva lishpoi, kiva lishpoi desadet, lifnei Hashem kiva lishpoi, kiva lishpoi desadet.
Are these people already? Oh. Hello again. It is Aaron Parry, stepping in for my good friend Sal Litvak, the accidental Talmudist, which I guess we have something in common, by the way. We share the same birthday, June 16th. Just thought I would throw that out there. But the only difference is he was an accidental Talmudist. I know that story, and I'm an intentional Talmudist, because that's the reason I went to Israel for the first time. At any rate, time for the bell, and time to light. Yeah, or. And that music we're hearing was a good friend of mine also, Shlomo Katz in Israel, Az Verananu, and he is awesome. I'd like to welcome, for those who I can see, Debbie from New Jersey, Michelle from Indiana, Celsa, I think, from Pasadena, but that's not here. That's from Pasadena, Texas. Marina Gonzalez, and whoever else is in the house. It's great to be with you. So, I'm going to answer the question that came from Buckthorn Studios. On the next Daf Zion, on the second page, how much more for a novice than an expert? Rabbi Kiva here is described as unsure, so he acted stringently in his esrog tithes. If we are not picking or choosing, but truly without enough info, may we also satisfy two opinions? And that's what he did, because he had a question. Is the Rosh Hashanah for Peirot, for Rosh Hashanah means the Yom New Year, for fruits, is it the first of the month of Shvat or the 15th? Beit Shammai said it was the first, and Beit Hillel said it was the 15th, but he was unsure. Maybe Beit Hillel said it's the first, and not Beit Shammai, and he wanted to do like Beit Hillel, but he wasn't sure whether he said the first or the 15th, so he had to take both opinions to be able to satisfy this particular mitzvah of tithing fruit. So I think that's the answer to the question. In this case, it wasn't contradictory. It was trying to be, because he didn't have enough information to ascertain which one is the Beit Hillel's opinion about Rosh Hashanah or the New Year for the trees. Now I'm going to share something with you today. It'll be different than yesterday. I'll go a little bit slower and try to explain a little bit more patiently. The walls that divide and walls that unite. Because much of Eruvin, as you've already discovered, talks about walls. Imaginary walls, actual walls, walls that fall. I mean, we have to get a grasp on what walls truly signify in traditional Judaism. Before I do that, however, I'd like to share with you a passage that you may have slipped your mind. This is like kind of PS on the Parsha. I didn't realize that kind of has this kind of twang to it, but at any rate, a postscript from last week's Parshas Reeh. Reeh is the fourth Parsha in the book of Deuteronomy. And we have part of this Parsha is a review of dietary laws we already learned in Leviticus, in Parshas Shmini. In the verse Yud Daled, or 14, number 6, 14:6, it says like this. In describing what we're supposed to take as a kosher animal, it says, all behema that is mafresis parsa, that has split hooves, shosas shesa, and it doesn't shtei prasos, it means it does it completely, malat gera, and it's a ruminant, it brings up the bolus of food, b'behema, amongst the four-legged creatures, ototochelu, that you should eat. So it's pretty clear in Jewish kashrus laws. We can only eat bovine, for instance, and sheep, and maybe goats. But the next verse seems to be a little bit problematic. I'll tell you why. Let's play the devil's advocate. Moses is trying to convince the Jewish people to follow him through the desert, giving them a whole slew of things to do and not to do, enlightening them, connecting them to God in a certain unique way that they're not used to. And he's throwing all these things at them. And then he goes ahead and he says, you know what? Through God's teaching, this you should not eat from those who are ruminants, and however they do not split their hooves. That's the camel, the hare, and the rock badger. So they're ruminants, but they don't have split hooves. And then one other animal called the chazir in the verse 8, it says, and the chazir, for it does split its hooves, but it does not bring up its bolus of food. It's not a ruminant. So these four things, the word always kind of excludes. It says this is an exception to the rule. So the question could be posed, and I'm going to tell you where it comes from in a moment. Why did Moshe have to do this? Just tell them you look for the animals that have both split hooves and the ruminants, and if not, you can't eat it. But he commits himself to saying, but there are four animals that are exception to the rule: the camel, the hare, the rock badger, and the chazir, and the swine. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, Moses, were you ever in New Zealand? Did you see the Tasmanian devils? Did he see the koala bears? These other creatures of different other continents? As far as we know, he didn't. So if he's telling us only these four creatures have one characteristic and not the other, what happens if later on someone finds a fifth species? Wouldn't that cast a doubt on the entire Torah, not just this law? This question is posed by the Talmud on page 60 in Tractate Chulin, which deals with a lot of these dietary laws in general. So, as a little historical aside, no, it's not an aside, actually, it's related. In 1984, there was this explorer by the name of Koch, K-O-C-H, who had learned this and had heard about it, and it occurred to him, wait a moment, maybe this is all made up. Maybe there's another species that Moses didn't know about. And so for 2 years, he circumvented the globe, and he went to every continent, examined thousands of animals, and tried to find another exception. He could not, except for he found the llama. Where he found this llama, which country, we would not know. And then when he researched further, he saw the llamas from the camel family. So therefore, he basically was able to prove the veracity of the Torah. This is one of many examples where, objectively speaking, if you think about this long enough through the angle that I'm telling you, which the sages are actually telling us, is that the only way Moshe can know this is that God conveyed it to him. He would not have dared venture a guess that, okay, these are four exceptions to the rule. He couldn't have done that. It wouldn't have done that. It cast aspersions. It would be a silly thing to do when Jewish people are very tough. They're very stiff-necked. They don't want to accept things. So this is a wonderful example, and there are others that kind of intrinsically prove the truth of the Torah. Now, of course, we believe that it was all given at Mount Sinai. We believers have no problem examining all of the evidence to realize that there was a revelation 3,300 plus years ago. This is the Torah that God conveyed to us, and the Talmud was given to us, I mentioned yesterday. The 2,711 pages of the Talmud are all filled with truth. There's no sheker. There's no falseness in any of the Talmud. It's based on what I was telling you yesterday. Even a minority opinion, even the one that we don't follow according to, just as I told you, the Torah is like a lemon. And just as nature can grasp almost opposites within the same species, within the same item, so too Torah can tolerate, so to speak, even the opposites. On some level, everything is true, even if we do not follow that particular opinion. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, I'd be fascinated to know what you have and thinking about that might be a refutation of what I'm saying, but I'd like to just throw that out for you. Now to the topic at hand. You are probably better aware of this poem than I am, and I just picked it up again because I was thinking about walls and how the discussion of Talmud is going over here. And it's from Robert Frost, right? Mending Walls, a famous poem. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two could pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I've come after them, and they made breaches in the walls. And the rabbits or the dogs are running through. They're pleased with the fact that there's a hole in the wall, but not I. Well, we'll see in a moment. I let my neighbor Noah beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go. To each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves and some so nearly like balls. Now, where it is, we do not need the wall. Why? He is all pine, and I am an apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Now, if I could put the notion to his head, why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. So why build a wall? He will not, and I'm skipping part of it, he will not go behind his father's sayings, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. So this poem brings up some interesting issues about, first of all, a breached wall. And a wall that serves a purpose, a very utilitarian purpose for those who need it and when they need it. So in our page of the Gemara, we have a number of interesting cases. We have a case of where a mavoi, which goes into a chutzner, that the inner wall or one of the walls of the chutzner is breached. What then? Where you're allowed to still carry, even though you made the tikkun, you made the rectification of, let's say, a lechi and a koreh or a deut, according to Rav's opinion, that you were diligent, but now a wall is breached. The Gemara discusses what can be done and how, and in what circumstances you can still carry, say, in the chatzar. Maybe not the mavoi, but maybe you'll be able to carry within the courtyard. So there's another issue about a wall that's made by the sea, or possibly called an ashpa. We see that an ashpa actually is like a refuse dump, and the Talmud right here tells us the one that maybe is 10 tfachim high. Remember, 10 handbreadths is the minimal size to have a mechitza, a partition or a wall that can serve the purpose of making it a separate domain. But however, in this mavoi mafulash, in this open corridor, it ends in the sea. Now the sea has waves that come in, and the Talmud discusses what about the water washing away, bringing in all sorts of debris and sand and the like. And if that happens, maybe it'll cancel the mechitza that was made on the other end by having the ashpa. What do we do under such circumstances? It's another interesting issue. Apparently, these were practical things that they were talking about, because in the Hardah, it seems to be that the river also they had built close to a river certain structures as well, and the houses along that, and we're trying to rely on this to be considered a viable mechitza. Now, an ocean is technically a karmelis. It's not karmelis is called a makom de rabbanan. It's a kind of no man's land. It's a neutral, but the Rabbanan said it's still forbidden, even though you're exempt from biblical consequences. But the Carmelis is an interesting place because it's neither a Rishus Yachid or a Rishus Rabim, not a private domain or a public domain. But yet the seawall, in certain circumstances, and walls and natural structures, like a mountainside or a hill, can actually form barriers that, depending on how what degree the slope is, to be able to affect a domain or create a domain with that wall. Now, the Gemara continues on the second side and gets into a discussion involving Rav Kahana, and who said a mavoi that on one side is long. How can I demonstrate this? actually, there's pictures over here. If you looked if you have the Talmud, maybe I'll show this to you, but it's going to be hard to see well. There's in the lower picture, it's demonstrating a wall that extends longer than the other wall of the alleyway, the mavoi. So the question is how to place the Koreh. And for demonstrative purposes, we have a nice example of that, a beam. Now, do you put the beam at an angle, or do you have to put it straight across? This is a discussion. And another part of this discussion seems to be is that what do you do about the space under the beam? And this could be larger than this over here. Are you allowed to, let's say, in making an eruv and closing the alleyway, could you even carry things underneath the beam itself? This seems to lend itself to a discussion that I think you might have come up before, but I don't know if it was discussed by Sal, of whether a Mechitza or the beam is matam Mechitza or matam Heker. What's the difference between the two? Is the purpose of the beam that you put across the crossbar on there's a lechi and this is the Koreh, is it to be a physical barrier, a Mechitza? Or is it to be because of Hekera or Heker? Or is it because it shows you that there is supposed to be a place to divide between one area and another area? And what's the difference between the two? Very good. Either way, in this discussion, we have to apply what's called gud achitz. We apply this idea of let the space above go all the way down to the ground as if it was covered. This would work if we're looking at it from the side of it being a mechitza. And if therefore let's take this approach itself. If therefore this is like a wall, then it stands to reason you can't function, you can't do anything under it because this is all filled in. So the inside part of that beam and toward the rest of the mavoi, not going into the other direction of the Rishus HaRabim, or the public domain, so only this, from this edge, inside, you were able to function or to do anything or carry. But under it, you can't, because that's supposed to be filled in. That's supposed to be the wall. Even according to the other opinion, it seems to be there's a side to say that even though it's an imaginary wall, you don't even, or it's just a heker rather, you don't even have to see it as a wall, but it's just up there to demonstrate the difference between one domain and another domain. Well, then apparently it would seem to be that it doesn't make a difference. You can go even on the outside edge as opposed to the inside edge. This is discussed in the Talmud in a very fascinating way, but it raises the very question of whether or not it serves as a physical wall or it feels as a symbolic wall. Now, this is the issue I want to elaborate on a little bit. In another halacha, which you might not be familiar with, another practice in Judaism, we see a fascinating story involving Solomon's Beit HaMikdash. It was Solomon's temple that he built on the Temple Mount. Well, that's why it's called the Temple Mount, because he built a temple. There's a source in the Talmud on page 51 of Succah, tractate Succah, which deals with the mitzvah of Succah, of course, where there it discusses a Tikun Gadel, a great rectification that was made later on, after King Solomon, in the Beit HaMikdash. What was this Tikun Gadol? So the Mishnah tells us in Sukkah, one who has not seen the happiness of the Simchas Beit HaShoeva, the water drawing that was done the day after the Yom Tov, the first day of Yom Tov of Sukkah, has not seen happiness in his days. Because after the first day of the Yom Tov, the holiday of Sukkah, they went down into the Ezras Nashim, to the women's court, and would make a great modification. So what does this mean? They went down to the Ezras Nashim, into the women's courtyard, and made a great modification. So the Talmud itself explains what this Tikun Gadol, or great modification, was. They learned that originally the women who came to the Beit HaMikdash were inside, and the men were outside. Now it sounds a little bit difficulty, and then they would come to lightheadedness and intermingling, and that's not a good thing. They established that the women should sit outside and then the men inside. That still didn't solve the problem. So he therefore established that the women should sit above and the men below. This is the Tikun. They made an aksadra, or a balcony for the women, and that was called the Ezras Nashim. That's how the name came to be, and those who are familiar with mostly Orthodox practice of the synagogue will realize that there is a partition put between the women, the men and the women. The women and the men and the women. It's not to shunt anyone aside. It's a special institution, a construction governed by spiritual and very spiritual concepts, and based on a scriptural allusion. And that passage, I think, is in the Sefer Tzefania, where it says that, now this is this interesting reasoning, that there is an obligation to separate men and women even when a eulogy will be made. This is talking about a eulogy being made for some Mashiach ben Yosef. There's how am I going to explain this? But anyway, there's two Mashiachim according to many Jewish traditions. There's going to be Mashiach ben Yosef and then Mashiach ben David. Apparently, Mashiach ben Yosef will die in battle. There will be a great eulogy for him in Yerushalayim. And in the wake of that will come Mashiach ben David and complete the task. So the question that comes up from this is, well, what did the men and women do when there would be a eulogy? What do we do today? Well, men sit separately and the women sit separately, at least in the Orthodox practice. So if in a situation where they're coming to eulogize, they're coming for a sad occasion, and yet we have to separate the men and the women. So when it's a joyous occasion, such as a Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the great celebration and the intermediate days of that holiday of Succah, even the more so there needs to be a separation. Now the question is, how does this separation work? Back then there was a separate section for the women to be. Not all synagogues are built that way, although many are. But there, in many situations, you have a divider between the men's side and the women's side. And it's a very honest thing. I told you, it's a spiritual thing, and it never be looked at as a negative, because they were very honest. The sages who instituted this were extremely honest with themselves. They said men are distracted by women, and women can be distracted by men. So what are we coming to pray for? We're praying, we're going to commune with God. We're supposed to be meditating and connected and not be distracted by anything superfluous. So this is the idea of the Mechitza in a synagogue. Is the Mechitza for the purpose of a Heker, or is the Mechitza in the synagogue for the purpose of being a physical barrier? This is discussed amongst the legal authorities, and this is nothing new today, but apparently, according to the letter of the law, many hold that the Mechitza really is to be a Heker. You don't even have to have it filled in according to this. It could be made of glass, for that matter, because the purpose is to separate each other. But then that might be the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law seems to favor a physical Mechitza. Now, a Mechitza for the purposes of Sukkah and for the purposes of a Eruv, we've learned, is 10 handbreadths, which is about 40 inches. Right, a handbreadth is like this. So, however, it seems to be that, according to one great authority, which many of the religious world follows, Rav Moshe Feinstein, a synagogue should be shoulder length, or approximately 18 tefachim, 18 handbreadths, nearly double the size of a mechitza that would be sufficient to establish a domain when it comes to making an eruv. So this is an interesting point, because if it's for this purpose, even if men and women could technically see over that height, apparently it satisfies more of the spirit of the law of having a practical separation. Now, where there is no gathering for the purpose of tefillah, and they're using the synagogue for something else, or at a simcha hall, or even though in the practice among many Orthodox Jews is to put up a mechitza, according to the letter of the law, it's not necessary. We do find another separation of men and women when Hannah, remember Hannah, the biblical Hannah, the mother of Shmuel, in the beginning of the book of Samuel, of Shmuel. So she is prayed in the at the makom of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, next to Eli HaKohen, and it seems to be that there was a mechitza between the two of them as well. Now, one other thing. If a mechitza is because of making it a barrier, a physical barrier, then what if it's made of lattice? What if, in other words, some that's half filled in and half open? Would that satisfy this requirement? Certainly, if it's for the sake of a heker, to something discernible to remind the congregants that they have to separate, then that should be sufficient. And if it's for the sake of making a solid wall between the two, apparently it wouldn't be sufficient. So this is discussed in Jewish law, the details of it. I'm not going to go into great detail. I just wanted to show an application of this idea of a wall being a mending wall. A Tikun Gadel, as the Talmud describes it on Solomon's temple, which, by the way, wasn't a simple thing to do, because King Solomon built the Beit HaMikdash, built the temple on the Temple Mount with precise accuracy, and every item and every brick and every whatever was used to build it, the gold on the outside and everything, it was all like spiritually imbued with significance. How could they go ahead and add this thing? And as I said, they found a scriptural passage that gave them license to be able to do that and add on to the binyan of Shlomo, on the building of King Solomon. Another part of this discussion, as walls would be, there's a wall of the walls of Jericho. We're all familiar with the story in the book of Joshua, in the 6th chapter, when Joshua pronounced a curse on any man or woman who would rebuild the city of Jericho. And he said, at the cost of that firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and the cost of a youngest son shall he set up its gates. This is really the gist of the verse that we find in Joshua on chapter 6, verse 26. Now, prior to this battle in Jericho, this was a miraculous thing. We all know the story of walking 7 times around and blowing the shofar, and the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. Now, those who study a little bit of archaeology might be familiar with a person by the name of Kathleen Kenyon, who had, when she excavated in the 50s, early 50s, something like that, she suggested that the walls did not fall away in a miraculous way. There must have been some kind of earthquake or whatever it is. I've studied the evidence, and I've looked into other places, and there's new evidence that suggests, just as the way it's described in Scripture, that the walls came straight down, and there's no doubt about it that this was a miraculous occurrence. But that's not the point I'm getting to. The point is that Jericho was to be the first city under Joshua that they would conquer coming into the land of Canaan. They had to do it right. Therefore, he also pronounced a curse on anyone who would take of the spoils of the city. We know Achan from the tribe of Judah was one guilty of doing so, and the entire Jewish nation suffered as a result of losing soldiers in that battle, and the battle of Ai, I think the next battle. So this was a serious thing. Now, if a prophet tells us not to do something, we'd be wise to avoid it. 500 years later, we find Ahab, thinking to himself, that Hiel was Hiel of Bethel tried to rebuild Jericho at the time of Achav. Hiel had 2 sons, Aviram and Segov. Guess what? We started putting the foundation down. His firstborn died, Aviram, and the second son, Segov, died when he started building the gates. Now, it's interesting, he didn't promise that Jericho would never be rebuilt. He technically said, if someone who tries to do this will suffer a tremendous loss. Now, it's interesting, why did this even happen? Why did someone think that it's a good idea, that good walls make good neighbors, and somehow we should rebuild the walls of Jericho? This has to be asked. Was he testing God? Didn't he believe, in the scripture? We have to understand the time of Ahab and Jezebel, his foreign wife that he married, they were into paganism. They were following after their own hearts, or the whatever local Baal, the Asherah poles that they were building and everything like that. In short, he did more to provoke God, Ahab did, than all the kings of Israel that came before him. And so he disregarded the curse of Jericho, of Yeshua. He allowed Hiel to rebuild those walls, and it was a very bad moral low point for the Jewish people at this time. came Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, on the scene. Even though he was pursued by Ahab and Jezebel, he caused the rain not to fall for 3 years. He faced off with the worshippers of the Baal at Mount Carmel, and defeated all of these priests and Malcreants among the people. And there was a change. But somehow, the provocation of Hiel and under Ahab was a demarcation for that sometimes walls are not a good thing. Sometimes walls have to remain in their place as rubble, as symbolism of that this was the city, the first one to be conquered, and everything had to be done right. That we're not going to derive benefit from any of this idolatry, any of the things that were dedicated to the worship of the Canaanites, who practiced the Molech, practice of sacrificing their own children. So this is an example, another I want to share about where we find also in Scripture mention of walls, and in this case a wall that should never have been built, or it was rebuilt at a very high cost. There's another example of a wall in a tree, just as seems to be that in the poem of Robert Frost, he makes reference to my apple orchard and his pine trees, and never the twain will they even meet, and so what's the big deal with having this wall? There's a story I want to share with you which illustrates another example of doing the right thing, in this case, unlike what happened in Jericho, and it's the story of Rabbi Yannai. Rabbi Yannai is mentioned many times in the Talmud, and this particular place is in Bava Batra, page 60. What had happened with Rabbi Yannai? Rabbi Yannai had two people come to him with a dispute. It seemed to be that there was a tree that overhung from one property over the wall into someone else's property. And the question was what to do about the overhanging branches. So the dispute was brought before Rabbi Yannai, and he said, "Go away, come back to me tomorrow." That night, Rabbi Yannai sent someone to cut down his tree. It turned out that he had a tree also that was hovering over into the public domain. He came back now, the person who had this issue with his neighbor, and he told the man, "You have to cut down your tree." The man persisted. "Don't you, Rabbi Yannai, have a tree that also overhangs into the public street? Don't be a hypocrite." So he said, "Go and see," Rabbi Yannai and mentioned. If mine is cut down yours. If mine is standing, you can let yours stand." So this story, which comes out of Bava Batra, it concludes with the maxim: trim yourself before you trim others. Kashot atzmecha v'achar kashot acherim. It's seen as something that you should be very careful not to be a hypocrite. And if you're giving someone else advice, you better take that advice as well. Maybe you could call that the 11th commandment. Because in this parsha that we're coming up to, which is of Shoftim, it says, "Judges and magistrates you should appoint for yourselves." This will be in Deuteronomy 16:18. Why does it say for yourselves? Just say establish judges and magistrates to carry out whatever civil laws that need to be carried out. It implies that leaders have to be judges over themselves first. Before they render a decision for somebody else, they have to make darn sure that they're following the dictates of a proper conduct. The only question is, why did Rabbi Yannai allow his tree to hang over into the public domain? So it occurred to him only once this person posed the question about that his neighbor wanted him to cut the tree. Up to that point, he thought that the shade was favorable. The people kind of liked the idea that next to this wall, was this tree, and it gave passersby an opportunity to have some respite from the sun and from the travels. But only once after this person had brought the question to him did he realize, maybe, sometimes you got to cut the tree down. Sometimes you got to, remove what you thought was a benefit for someone else, and go against even your own thinking. So that's why that's a beautiful insight. I don't want you to be lost over here. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sharecha. You shoftim and shotrim. You judges, you people who have to make judgment calls on, and many of us do all the time. Lecha, make it for yourself first. Understand what the parameters are before you explain to others, ask others to follow a certain practice. So up till now, I've been sharing with you about the ideas of walls and how they serve a purpose. Are they for Heker, for symbolism, or they're there specifically to be a bona fide Mechitza or division, or in a positive way, a solid wall? So I wanted to go revisit one thing that I was sharing with you yesterday. When I mentioned about Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, coming and helping us decide what to do, to decide between two differing opinions, perhaps. And the answer to this is that he will not come as a prophet. He cannot, because it's the same thing with the bat kol, with the heavenly voice that came out. Lo b'shamayim hi. It cannot come in the form of a prophecy. But Elijah the prophet can come as another sage and share his wisdom with us. And if it can clarify a certain reality, we call it metziut in Hebrew. It doesn't translate itself well into English, but a certain reality about nature, about the nature of a certain given issue. Well, then we can rely on that, because he's just sharing with us, clarifying things that we could not on our own, but yet he's not deciding what the halacha is. So this is the unique role of Eliyahu Hanavi. So I was thinking to myself, we also find that Eliyahu Hanavi fares very prominently in a number of stories and a number of issues. He at one time he mentioned about the Jewish people being not diligent in mitzvot, and then God said to him, you know what, you're going to have to come and witness when they do the mitzvah Brit Milah. I think I tangentially mentioned that before. There's another notion to this, that when we do mitzvot, when we connect, the word the mitzvah really means to connect. When we do the right thing, we create malachim, we create angelic beings that accompany us wherever we go, and they can do tremendous things for us, protect, etc. But also, according to the Arizal, the great 16th century Kabbalist who lived in the city of Tzfat, and his writings we have to this day kind of made it codified, very symbolic, using a lot of symbolism, but it made the teachings of the Kabbalah a little bit more tenable to us and kind of organized. And among the teachings that he had was that when you do a mitzvah, a letter connected to that mitzvah, one of the 22 letters of the Aleph Beit, are kind of like engraved on your head in a spiritual way. Some people could see this. And when you do another mitzvah, you kind of remove that one and you put the new mitzvah up there on your forehead. And it's an amazing thing. That's why people didn't want to come to these Kabbalists, to these great spiritual leaders, and see them and have them see their face, because they might have been doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. But he himself was extremely meticulous about giving away a lot of charity, even to the last, what denomination they had back then, dinar, or whatever they had in the 16th century Israel. And he taught, he said the mitzvah of tzedakah, of charity, seems to have all-encompassing effect on a person, that it never leaves their forehead. That particular mitzvah the person does, like it's tzedek, it's righteousness, it remains with that person. And so therefore I'm going to tell you the following story, kind of conclude everything for now, and you can ask your questions of anything that I talked about up till now. But I just wanted to end on this very spiritual connection with Eliyahu Hanavi. It is said that the Matteh Ephraim, he was the author of, that's the name of the book he wrote. He lived maybe 200 years ago. He was a very wealthy Jew, a scholar, and he owned his own bank. And once a poor person came to the bank and asked for a large loan. Now the Matteh Ephraim was a very generous person. He gave him a form to fill out, and he said, you need 2 arevim. You need to have 2 co-signers. In Hebrew it's called arevim. It's interesting. The word eruv is related to the word arevim. And you'll think about it. You know, an eruv is kind of combining something, and then an arev is someone who is sharing their wherewithal to help you pay back a loan. The poor person couldn't find an arev. People knew that he was a pauper and would have a hard time paying it back. So the pauper wrote on the line where it said, you know, where you're supposed to put the arevim signature, these co-signers. He said, Liha kesef v'liha zahav ne'um Hashem. To me is the silver, and to me is the gold, so says God. Implying that Hashem, the God himself, would be the co-signer for this loan. he was moved by this, the Matteh Ephraim, and he issued the loan. A half a year later, when the loan was due, the Matteh Ephraim, for some reason that day, was not feeling well, and he asked his wife to go run the bank. That night, as they were discussing what transpired in the course of that day, she told him that she lent a lot of money to a particular poritz, a certain landowner. The Matteh Ephraim asked, "Wait a minute, we don't have any money. How did you lend him? Give him a big loan?" He says, "You don't understand. No, someone came in earlier and paid up a debt." He thought to himself, "That pauper, the poor person." He checked his records. That's the only person had any loan due on that date. He asked his wife, "Did that poor person come and pay it back?" And he says, "No. Actually, someone else came and paid the debt." At that moment, he realized that he had missed an opportunity to see Eliyahu Hanavi. There was Elijah the prophet himself coming to pay for this guy's debt. And so, in other words, God was the cosigner. So God sent his shliach, he sent his messenger, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. And he thought to himself, why was I not meritorious to have to see him? And he thought to himself, you know what? Because I knew it was stressful for that pauper to go get a cosigner, and it was embarrassing for him. Maybe I should just give him the loan straight out. So he thought to himself, as this result, he really should have pursued this mitzvah with more ahava, with more love, and more concern, and more understanding of the situation that this pauper was in. So you never know. If you do the right thing, Elijah the prophet could appear to you too. So questions. Vaughn. Okay, my question regarding walls has to do with Joshua and taking of Jericho. Did the walls literally physically fall supernatural, or is it to be taken enough as a metaphor? I guess you mean metaphor. No, they physically fell in a supernatural way. That's our Kabbalah. That's what we understand according to Jewish tradition, Torah tradition. Next question from Charles Abraham Ramirez Verdugo. Our sages teach that we should follow the majority, not the minority. But in the story of the Meraglim, the sin of the spies, the majority were wrong, and the minority, Joshua and Caleb, were right. How do you understand this in the light of what we are learning? This is a very good question. In the story of the Meraglim, let me illustrate with a similar story to this. Once it was posed to Rav Chaim of Brisk, the famous Brisker Rav in the city. Was he in the city of Brisk at the time? I have no idea. Someone came to him and he said, you Orthodox Jews are the minority. The reformers seem to be in the majority at this point, in Germany at least. How come we don't go after them? And he answers it in a very clever way. He said, we only go after the majority when we're in doubt about something. But in this case, we're not in doubt about anything. It is very clear that the Torah approach is the right approach, and to be observant and to connect with God through his mitzvot. And then the end of the discussion. So in this question here, the two Caleb ben Yefuna and Yeshua ben Nun had the aura of those who knew what was right. It wasn't even a doubt. It was not a question of just let's take by majority rule and figure out what to do over here. Yes, the land is good. The land is the one that God promised to us, and Moshe Rabbeinu is not lying to us. He brought us out of Egypt, and we crossed the Red Sea because of him. He gave us the Luchos Habris. So likewise, he knew what he was talking about, that the land is good and the land is ours for the taking. In such a case, there's no question that it wasn't a question of who the majority were, who the minority were over here, because this was the right thing to do. There was not a doubt. And Celsa Canedo, I hope I pronounced that right. Since charity is so important, could charity be given not just as money, but also as talent, time, and kindness? Absolutely. In fact, the Talmud makes this point for you. I forget where it is, but it makes the following point. It says that when you do Gemilut Chasadim, which is loving kindness, you can do it with your money, or you can do it with your body. And in certain ways, the kindness you give, which is of your time, as you said, and your talent and the things that you can afford to offer into a certain situation, you're engaging yourself even more than you simply giving a check or writing or handing some money to a needy person. Don't get me wrong, that's a very big thing. But the Talmud says that when you're giving with your person, because time is money, so it's really you're giving with your money and resources and your person. And that sometimes, in many cases, is greater than simply just giving charity alone. I think that answers your question. So is there any other? This is the two questions I have for today.